Here's everything you need to know about the 8th house in your natal chart. And stick around until the end of this video where I'll be sharing with you more resources that you can use in order to understand the houses in your natal chart in a deeper way. The 8th house is traditionally called the idle place, but it is also known by the name of Epikataphora, which means descending into the gates of Hades. In the same way as planets that find themselves in the 2nd house have the promise of eventually rising towards the horizon in the east, any planet that finds itself in the 8th house has the promise of continuing to descend into the underworld of the west. Which is one of the reasons why the ancients thought that the 8th house was one of the most evil parts of heaven. The 8th house is a house of death, of debt, and of other people's money. And very often, the other people who are being referred to in the 8th house are our 7th house marriage partners. Therefore, when we find the rulers of our 2nd house and 8th house in opposition to each other, that can oftentimes represent that one of the greatest sources of contention within our romantic relationships are the monetary affairs between ourselves and our romantic partners. Now, even though a lot of people tend not to like to talk about the topic of death within the 21st century, the 8th house is also the house of death. And the planet that rules the 8th house was traditionally called in certain schools of astrology the anaretic planet. The word anaretic comes from the Greek word anareta, which means destroyer. If we happen to have a very auspicious 8th house, then very often our 8th house can also represent the money that we receive from our ancestors in the form of inheritances. As a house of death, if we find the rule of the ascendant in the 8th house or the ruler of the 8th house in the ascendant, or if we find the rule of the ascendant in the 8th house while also having the rule of the 8th house in the ascendant, that can oftentimes indicate people who are living a very risky life or people who have a particular type of employment that potentially puts them at risk more often than not. From a traditional astrology perspective, the 8th house has nothing at all to do with sex or sexuality. And this is something that we find only happening in modern astrology because modern astrology tells us that the meanings of the houses as well as the signs of the zodiac are the same, which is emphatically untrue. In traditional astrology, the houses as well as the signs of the zodiac, even though both of them consist of 12 components, stand separate and apart as their own unique symbolic systems with their own unique reason for being. Therefore, I'm sad to say, but the 8th house has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with sex or sexuality. Now, as far as sex is concerned, from a medical astrology perspective, what the 8th house definitely has to do with are the bladder, the excretory system in general, as well as the genitals as organs of excretion. As a succedent house, we would assume that planets within the 8th house also have 50% of power with which to express themselves. However, since the 8th house is also having a quincunx aspect to the ascendant, and therefore unable to receive any of the radiance or the universal life force energy held within the ascendant itself, it's questionable whether or not the succedent nature of the 8th house can actually contend with the fact that the 8th house has no relationship whatsoever to the ascendant, and is seen as being greatly lacking in power to support life, as well as the planets placed within it from that perspective. If we apply our Chaldean order of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon to the 8th house, then the 8th house is once again coming back around to Saturn. Saturn, the god of time who gave us our body in our 1st house, is the same Saturn who takes our body away through death in our 8th house. Though both the 8th house and the 2nd house are considered to be the gates of Hades and therefore both naturally having a relationship with death, what we find in both the 8th and the 2nd house are the promises of riches that exist within the underworld, with the 8th house having a relationship with the mineral riches that exist within the earth itself, whereas the 2nd house has more to do with our actual tangible money. To receive a free sample chapter of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, set to be published in spring 2023, sign up for my newsletter down below where you'll also gain access to other giveaways as well as free lectures from my private masterclass series. If you've enjoyed this video on the 8th house, then you're definitely going to enjoy my next video on the 9th house.